Great. Yep. So thanks for everyone for joining me today. I'm going to be talking about user-centered design in the third sector. And I've called my talk Doing More with Less because that is kind of a key theme of trying to be a designer in this sector. So just a bit about me before we start. So I started off my career working in the public sector and actually started off working in content. So content is my first love before moving into service design. And then I went and worked for a charity and I now work for a consultancy called TPXimpact, where I'm working with kind of government and third sector clients. And I got really interested in the third sector kind of during lockdown when, like everyone else, I was stuck at home. And I really wanted to kind of do something to use my skills to help people. And I discovered all of these organizations like the Scottish Tech Army, Tech for Good Live, and a bit later, Digital Candle, that were kind of trying to support these third sector organizations that were having to shift to digital service delivery for the first time. So they're having to kind of totally change the way that they delivered their services. It was a really crazy time, but I really enjoyed kind of working with charities. So I decided to leave my job in the public sector and I went to go work for RNID, which is a charity that supports people who are deaf, have hearing loss, or tinnitus. And kind of before going into this talk, I thought it would be important to kind of say, like, what is the third sector? What do we mean by the third sector? So the third sector includes organizations that are nonprofit and non-governmental, such as charities, social enterprises, and voluntary groups. And I'm going to talk a bit about kind of why I got so interested in kind of third sector design in the first place. So I was at an away day with my RNID colleagues, and we were talking about some of the challenges we were facing, and then it hit me. We can't be the only charity designers experiencing these challenges or trying to solve these problems. I thought for sure, like, other organizations are trying to do the same things or they're having the same issues, and like we just don't know about it because we're not talking to each other, kind of working in these silos. So I hunted down other charity designers on LinkedIn, which for someone who's a very socially awkward introvert, like did not come naturally to me. But I basically I found a list of UK charities and I started kind of going on LinkedIn and seeing if I could find people that had designer in their title. And I just started kind of messaging people and having conversations. And I also put up a survey on LinkedIn to kind of find out a bit more about some of the challenges that third sector designers were facing, how they were kind of currently connecting with each other, and trying to see if there was an interest in kind of getting together so we could learn from each other and find out about the things that we were working on. And a lot of people were interested in that. So I decided to try to start a third sector design community of practice. So we met to discuss what challenges we faced as user-centered designers in the third sector and how we could overcome them. And some of what I'm going to talk about tonight is going to be kind of things that came out of that session and some of these kind of one-to-one conversations that I had with other designers. But the big theme is that doing user-centered design in the third sector can be hard. And there are a number of different reasons for that I'm going to talk about. Some of them may sound really familiar to you, even if you work in other sectors. They're not all things that are specific to the third sector, but they may be things that are more common in the third sector. So one of the biggest things that people talked about was that user-centered design is less established in the third sector than in other sectors, so it can be harder to get buy-in. Unlike in the public sector, where you have established frameworks like the gov.uk design principles or the Scottish approach to service design, you don't have anything like that in the third sector. And in other sectors, like the tech sector, for example, again, it's fairly well established, but there's a lot less kind of design maturity in the third sector. And that means that when designers are trying to get support for the work that they want to do from people in senior leadership, it can be hard to kind of get that buy-in because they don't necessarily understand the way that we work or the value of what we do. You may not have many colleagues to collaborate with, which can lead to feelings of isolation. So a lot of third sector organizations, if they have design teams at all, have fairly small design teams. So it might be fairly different to, for those of you who work in public sector or like in a consultancy to the way, the kind of teams that you're used to working with. So when I was at RNID, we had a design team of 6 that included a service design lead, 2 service designers, 2 content designers, and an interaction designer. But I spoke to people who were the only designer in the organization or were one of 2 designers in the organization. And they could find that really challenging because if you're working on a really kind of challenging design problem and you just want to kind of get feedback from someone else, you don't always have that person who you can kind of go and speak to. And that could be really difficult. There can also be a lack of career progression opportunities in this sector for people who want to do design. If you're the only designer in your organization and you want to progress to a more senior role, there isn't really anywhere for you to go. And that can also lead to kind of lack of retention of service designers and other kind of user-centered designers in the third sector. So there tends to be quite a lot of turnover, which can lead to kind of instability within the kind of design team in that organization. A lot of designers talked about having to wear all the hats, which can lead to burnout. And by that, I mean having to do things that maybe kind of outwith your normal job description. And I'll just give an example from a project that I worked on. So I was brought into this project as a service designer, but because we only had one user researcher in the organization and she was working on another project, I also did most of the planning of the user research, conducting that research, and analyzing and synthesizing that research. So I was essentially the user researcher as well. In addition to that, I was doing things like setting up stand-ups and retros and making sure that the project was going to be delivered on time. So I was kind of acting as the delivery manager as well. In some cases, this can be seen as a positive thing in a way because you kind of get the opportunity to do a lot of different things just because there aren't enough people to kind of do all the things that need doing. But it can also be really overwhelming. You often need to do a lot with few resources in the third sector. You just don't have access to kind of the same number of people and the amount of money that you might have in the public sector or private sector. And a lot of people who choose to go work in the third sector, they do so because they're really passionate about the work that they do and the people that these organizations are supporting. And they really, really want to help. But it can be hard to do that when you just don't have the people or the money that you need to kind of do the design work that needs to be done. You also may have to navigate funding restrictions and the impact these can have on services. So I'll give an example from a project that I worked on where we were working on a service that was UK-wide, but it was funded by different funding bodies in different parts of the country. And those different funding bodies could sometimes put different restrictions or requirements on how the service needed to be delivered in that area. So they might say, in addition to these kind of 3 core services that the service provides, you also have to do this additional thing. Or they might ask for additional bits of data to be gathered for service users. And this was really hard because what we were trying to do as part of this project was standardize the service across the UK. And it was really, really hard to do that when we were having to kind of manage all these different funding requirements and restrictions. And when you're sort of relying on external funding to fund your service, you also run the risk of losing that funding. So, for example, you may get funding to run a service for a set period of time. So maybe that's like 12 months. And at the end of those 12 months, you then have to reapply for funding. But you may be competing against a number of different organizations for that funding. And even if you're delivering a really successful service, you might not get that funding and that service may have to end. And that can be really frustrating. You also need to kind of manage the balance between meeting user needs and getting donations, which was something that I didn't think about at all before I started working in a charity. When I was working in the public sector, didn't really think about where the funding for these services was coming from because most of our funding was coming from the Scottish government. But if you're working in a charity, you're trying to kind of support people, but in order to support people, you need to kind of get donations so that you have the money to run the services to support people. So it's thinking about like how you can kind of build donation asks into services, and getting that balance right can be really hard. So this is an example of a service that I worked on. So this is the homepage for RNID's online hearing test. And it says, check your hearing in just 3 minutes with our free online hearing test. 345,384 people have taken the test so far. Check your hearing. And this was an existing service that we were redesigning. And as part of that redesign, our fundraising team wanted us to look at how we could build a fundraising ask into the service because it was a really high traffic service. So a lot of people were using it and they thought it would be a really good opportunity to kind of get some more donations. So we had this organizational need to get donations so we can support more people with hearing loss. But there was also this user need to feel reassured and supported after finding out that I may have hearing loss. And we had to kind of think about how we might build a donation ask into the service in a way that's effective but also appropriate. And when we did our initial prototyping, we tested our prototypes. We did not get this right the first couple of times. People were saying to us, I've just found out that I might have hearing loss and you're asking me for money. And they found that kind of really off-putting because what they needed was to kind of feel that reassurance and support after getting what could be finding out something that could be quite surprising and upsetting. So we had to kind of really think carefully about like, kind of how do we craft this donation ask and how do we do it in a way that can help us kind of meet our organizational needs, but also meet user needs as well. And this was kind of our attempt to kind of get that balance right. So you've got a scientist here and some text that says, we rely on donations from people like you. Only 83p is spent on research for every person with hearing loss. This is compared to £16 for every person with sight loss. Help us fund research to find new and better treatments to change people's lives. Donate now. And we found that this donation ask, which was kind of framed around funding for research, which is a positive thing, was less jarring than some of the other messaging we had tried. We also put the donation ask at the bottom of the results page so that someone would get their result, and then they would also see information about like what that result meant, what they should do next, and how they could get support. And they would see that before they saw this donation ask. So that was our attempt to kind of get that balance right, but it can be really tricky. When you work in the third sector, you may work with vulnerable people. So this can be the case in other sectors as well, but a lot of these third sector organizations exist to support vulnerable or marginalized people. So for example, like disabled people, asylum seekers, people who've experienced domestic abuse, people living in poverty. And there'll be kind of additional safeguarding concerns that you need to think about when you're designing services in this area. And you also need to really kind of be mindful of how working with vulnerable people could impact your own mental health, because you might be hearing stories about things that people have experienced that are really, really hard to hear. So you have to kind of think about how you can protect yourself as a designer as well. People also talked about how it can be hard to fight for accessibility. So unlike in the public sector, where there are, there's specific legislation that requires public sector services to be accessible, you don't have that in the third sector. So what people will have to, you'll have to comply with things like the Equality Act. There aren't kind of specific guidelines and requirements around accessibility in that sector specifically. And people talked about feeling like they were the only person in their organization that was kind of trying to promote accessibility, and they were really struggling to kind of get support for that. So how can we overcome these challenges? So that was something that we kind of talked about as well at the session. So these are some of the things that might be able to help. So when we think about this problem around struggling to get buy-in, one thing that people said really helped was sharing success stories about how taking a user-centered design approach has benefited users and the organization. And you can do this through blogs or show and tells or internal communication channels, but really using kind of storytelling techniques to kind of show the benefits of a user-centered design approach, particularly when it comes to things like user research, being able to kind of share stories of things that of actual users and things that they've said and challenges that they've experienced can be really powerful. And that kind of leads into kind of bringing people on the journey. So some of the designers that I spoke to said they'd had success with kind of involving colleagues, senior leaders, and stakeholders in the design process to help get them to see design as an enabler and not as a blocker. So I know that there were experiences I had where I joined project teams and was seen as that blocker initially because there would be senior leaders who had ideas about what they wanted to do. And here I was coming in as the service designer and asking a lot of questions. And that wasn't always welcome initially. But when I got people involved in kind of the design process, so taking notes at user research sessions, being involved in prototyping and mapping services, people were able to see the way that like working in this way was beneficial and how it helped kind of the services that we were building be better. So yeah, I found that to be kind of really helpful. Showing the risks of not taking design approach can also be helpful. So if senior leaders feel that taking a design approach is too risky or will take too long, highlight the time and costs of having to redesign the service if you find out it isn't working once it's live. So, they would say, oh, you want to do this 8-week discovery and that's just going to take too much time. But actually, like, there's real value in taking a user-centered approach. And there's a time-saving value and there's a cost-saving value. And if you're trying to explain to them that if they design a service and they launch it without kind of doing this user research, and then they find out that it's not working, and then they have to go back and do it again, it's going to take a lot more time and cost a lot more money. So coming back to this thing around like not having many colleagues to collaborate with, it's really important that we connect with each other. So identifying opportunities to collaborate and learn through communities of practice like this one, and informal chats. So I really wish I'd been able to kind of do more with the third sector design community of practice. I really kind of wanted to build it up into something big. And because I ended up sort of leaving my role and changing jobs, I wasn't able to really do that. But I really wanted to kind of build those connections because there does seem to be a real need for it. And when it comes to things like informal chats, I would always encourage people to not be shy about kind of getting in touch with other people that you think are doing things that might be interesting or related to the work that you're doing. So for example, like I would have people get in touch with me at times and say, I've read this blog post that you've written and we're working on something similar. Do you want to have a discussion? And I was always happy to do that. I always had time for those people. And I think most people are the same. So don't be shy about kind of making those connections. Coming back to this challenge around working with vulnerable people. I think it's really important for us as designers to take care of ourselves, because listening to people in crisis and not being able to help can be challenging. Um, Empathy and compassion fatigue training may help designers recognize the emotional impact of our roles and respond to symptoms of compassion fatigue. But also kind of talking about our experiences with other members of the design community can help, and that's where those connections become so important. Again, coming back to this idea around challenges with fighting for accessibility, um, one thing that people have said has worked is kind of showing how easy it can be to be accessible, which is not to say that like accessibility is a really easy thing. I know it's a really complicated thing. There's a lot involved in kind of being truly accessible, but I think sometimes people have this idea that like accessibility is the thing that like the tech people do or the web people do, but actually there are a lot of things that are pretty simple that can make a big difference and make things more accessible for everyone. For example, like writing clear, jargon-free information. I'm sure this is the right group to kind of say this to. You all know this, that that is something that makes things better for everyone and more accessible for everyone. Offering multiple ways for people to contact you. So, you know, having the option of like phone and email and maybe a web chat, publishing information on web pages instead of PDFs, which is something I am always talking about because I'm not a fan of PDFs. You can make things so much more accessible by having HTML web pages, and adding alt text to images. And these are all kind of small things that aren't that hard that people can do. I think it can also be helpful to kind of show people the benefits of accessibility. Making services more accessible isn't just the right thing to do. It also means that more people will be able to use them. And ultimately, you know, these organizations exist because they want to be able to help people and they want people to use their services. So talking about accessibility in a way that shows how it will help them help more people can be really beneficial. So that was a lot about kind of like negative things, and I wanted to kind of spend some time focusing on some more positive things about user-centered design in the third sector. Um, and I think it's really great that more third sector organizations are thinking in a user-centered way. Hiring or working with user-centered designers is going to lead to better services, which is going to lead to better support for marginalized groups, which is great. That's what everyone wants. And you've got organizations like Catalyst and Third Sector Lab, which are offering resources and training for charities in accessibility and user-centered design. So these are resources that are aimed specifically at charities, kind of using examples that they can relate to. And I think that that's really important. And I'm not just saying that because I wrote some of these. I think it's a really good thing to have kind of tailored information that's like specifically for the charity sector. And some charities are doing good design work. So I thought I would just share a couple of examples of things that are happening across different charities that I think are really good. So you've got kind of content design at Scope. So the content design team has written about some of the design work they've done on their blog, including things like using content patterns, doing user research in the context of poverty and inequality, and running a co-production pilot. And these are all things that other organizations can kind of learn from and replicate in their own organization. And it's all explained in a really kind of clear and concise way. And you've got the Mind, Influence, and Participation Toolkit, which is a resource for anyone whose organization or workplace wants to engage with people with mental health problems in a meaningful way. So it's all about kind of showing people how they can design with people with mental health problems instead of for them. You can there's just a screenshot here of kind of the homepage of that toolkit. But yeah, it's really a good way of kind of getting other organizations to think about how they might be able to design things with people. We've got the RNID User Insights Library, which is something that I worked on. So I'm maybe a bit biased, but I think it's a really good project. And This library aims to make it easier to manage, store, and share insights from user research. So this is just a screenshot of a prototype that we put together that would allow people to search for user research insights by category. And this kind of came about because, like a lot of organizations, R&ID realized that we had all this great user research, um, but people weren't able to find it because what would often happen is a project would do user research, it would get stored in that project folder, and then if people weren't aware of that project, when they went to start their own project, they wouldn't know about that research. So they were either kind of starting their project without all of the relevant information that they needed, or they were replicating research that had already been done. So this was kind of our attempt to make it easier for people to find that research and use it when they were kind of starting or running projects. I also really like these cost of living crisis stories from Citizens Advice. So Citizens Advice created this story series to show how multiple aspects of the cost of living crisis collide and compound one another to impact real people. So you may have seen Citizens Advice had created this cost of living tracker, which kind of tracked the cost of living crisis in terms of numbers and the sort of inquiries that they were getting. And what they did was kind of take that numbers aspect and kind of have these stories that sort of show the people behind the numbers. And I just thought this was a really good way to kind of use storytelling and user-centered approach to kind of focus the cost of living crisis, which can seem really abstract, and focus that like on the impact on real people. So just to kind of summarize, being a designer in the third sector comes with challenges that people may not face or may face to a lesser extent in the public and private sectors. But despite these challenges, there are opportunities for third sector designers to collaborate with each other and senior leaders to influence change. And user-centered design may be less mature in the third sector than in other sectors, but that is changing, and there's some great work happening.